Good evening and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Our guest this evening is Neal Shapiro, who's the president, CEO of WNET, Channel 13, the PBS station here in New York. And Neal also has had a distinguished career. I don't have time for the entire resume, but as former president of NBC News, among other stops, and unquestionably the most decorated guest we've ever had. With 32 Emmys, 31 Edward R. Murrow Awards, and, because we're Columbia, the most important, 3 Columbia DuPont Awards. So, Neal, thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
So, Neal, I grew up in a PBS-heavy household, Boston area, WGBH, with shows like Zoom and The Electric Company, the Boston Pops. Do you find today, is there still that same passion for public television at WNET, but more broadly public television that that we felt then?
In fact, in some ways, there's more passion for public television, even though the media universe is much more crowded. When I was a kid, I grew up in Albany. There were 4 stations, so the options were limited. Now there's infinite choices. And yet, on the other hand, in terms of sort of the quality television, I think as there's a race to the bottom in terms of reality TV, I think public television and public media are more outstanding, not just the quality of the work, but truly outstanding in their field, which is why, in fact, the ratings for public television are going up when other television is coming down. So I think, in fact, in that way...
That's a man bites dog story.
Exactly,
right? So,
exactly.
Is it, do you find that people that you are, coming in contact with every day, whether it's through, through events or your day-to-day work, are throwing you, everybody sort of has their view about public television or Channel 13 from what they grow up or what they're watching now, and you've got the, hey, why don't you do this, or how come you don't do this, or suggestions for something else, how come this isn't on the website, or whatever it is?
Well, I have 2 thoughts about that. The first thought is, unlike commercial television, there's a legacy feeling for public television. So people will say, I grew up on Sesame Street, I remember these shows. Even if you love commercial television, people don't associate the shows with the networks. So Star Trek fans don't say, gee, I love that one was on NBC, right? Or even the great classic shows, to the degree they're still around. And as we talked about generationally, they're not so much. There's not that kind of legacy, but there is for public media. The other thing that's different, and I think it's different about TV than maybe other fields, because people watch TV and it's a consumer-driven medium, everybody has ideas about what makes good TV. Now, you would never meet a heart surgeon and say, I have a great idea, here's what I would do. Right? Because we're not all heart surgeons, but we're all consumers of TV. So I get lots of ideas about things we could do, what we should do better, what should be more available, all the time.
So you mentioned the word legacy, which is, it reminds me also of a discussion that we had on the show recently with Danny Bennett, who's the son of Tony Bennett and has kind of the marketing mastermind of his career for the last generation. And Danny said, that he feels this pressure, obligation, opportunity that he's marketing not just a performer or not just a product, music, but a legacy. And you're, kind of in that same position, almost like a public trust. Does that constrain what you sort of risks that you can take and how you go about things when I'm not just a station or not just a show, but a legacy?
It's a little more challenging because on the one hand, we want to be true to the legacy of who we are and where we've been, which is to say quality programs, great children's media. On the other hand, we're also recognize that we need to be innovative. That we can't just appeal to viewers who like what we've done. We have to appeal to viewers who like the future. There are many reasons why Downton Abbey is such a gigantic success, but one of them is, on the one hand, it pays tribute to a classic show like Upstairs, Downstairs, which is a classic PBS show, and yet the pacing of it, the way it's written, is much more like contemporary drama on television. The scenes are faster, the writing is sharper. In that way, I think it's a great example of being true to what you were, but also sort of looking forward.
So one of the things, and I took this is like my Tim Russert moment, so I got a quote from you, which is the New York Times. You said it was sort of as leaving NBC, you reflected on kind of that you were towards the end in that management position, missing the opportunity for the kind of creativity that I've had in previous jobs. Do you get to be creative in a place where you've got a lot to manage? You said you've got to innovate, so do you get the opportunity for creativity that you as well as the station needs?
Unquestionably. I mean, I'm a very lucky man in this job. I spent about a third of my time sort of running the station, which is kind of the management job that any good executive should do. I spent about a third of my time raising money, which is a peculiar job in public media, but peculiar to public media. And then I spent about a third of my time actually in the creative process. So since I've been there, we've increased the number of arts and culture offerings by about 300%. We've done more in news and information than we ever have before. We've done much more online than we ever have before. And I'm involved in all those discussions. So I consider myself both very lucky and more satisfied than I was as an executive at NBC.
You mentioned the arts community. So the cliche might be, oh, people in the arts who are buying it or are in that world, they're not TV watchers. And which by the way I know from experience, not necessarily true, but what's it like kind of, and you've made arts a big part, I think, of the identity here, you know, for WNET. So what's it like kind of working with a community that's not, unlike, let's say, the LA Hollywood community, you know, that is immersed in TV every day? What is it like kind of working with and bridging with that community?
Well, to begin with, this is a good example, and you probably hear some other lectures about how conventional wisdom is often wrong. So when I got to 13, my successor had been there 20 years, very smart fellow, but he said to me, here's what I've learned and what I think you're going to find out, is you really can't do local shows in New York, because New York is, we're citizens of the world, so people don't want to give money just for a New York-based show. They only want to do national shows, which may have been true, but isn't, as I found out, isn't true. So we launched a weekly show that was then called Sunday Arts, aptly on Sunday. We had so little money, I was the host. But for our first year, the ratings did well, and by the second year, I fired me as the host and hired Paul Zahn and Philippe de Montebello, much better hosts, and the show was every week in prime
That was
time.
the management part of your responsibilities, and you executed
and
well.
Fired me. And the show continues to do well in prime time. But we've observed something about that which works with every other art show we have, which is that when you see something on TV, instead of actually taking away from the live audience, it grows it. So when we highlight any exhibit on, now it's called NYC Arts, attendance for that exhibit always goes up. The Jewish Museum was going to do something on Houdini, and we said, let's do a whole half hour on it, because it was both Houdini's a great story, and some people in the museum were a little concerned, well, gee, if you put it on TV, and in fact, attendance was up 75% over expectations. I think this is a little bit like what happened in sports. So if you think about this, every time a new development has come on, the world of sports is worried about it. Will radio drive down attendance? Will TV drive attendance? Now you can see more sports on more platforms, on more devices than ever before, and attendance of the games is at the highest point ever. So I think what happens is people see things on TV and it whets their appetite, and they want to go see it in person. One more great example of what I think we can do, and why I love public media and think about the power of TV. TV has the power to reach things which are otherwise bounded by geographical constraints. If you sold every single performance at every showing at Lincoln Center, it's like 19,000 seats. Right? You know, 19,000 people were watching us at 5 in the morning. So we did a series called Theater Close-Up about off-Broadway shows. We did the first two shows we did, one was at the Mint Theater. If they sold every single seat, and they didn't, it would have been 4,000 seats. 120,000 people saw it in the first week on public television. The next show, Dick Cavett played himself in a show about Hellman versus McCarthy. 2,400 seats, 140,000 people saw it in the first week. That's on the arts community to say, look what we can do that frankly nobody else can.
And are people in the arts community and Broadway and you know, theater obviously so central kind of commercially, not just artistically in New York, are they getting it the way you're getting it, or are you kind of do you still have to be an evangelist to convince people of the value of that?
I have to be a little bit more an evangelist, but there is, like the Kevin Costner, you know, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of, once you actually start seeing it work, so now theater companies are starting to approach us.
So tell me about some of the other, you know, if somebody's going to the WNET website, they're going to see a little link to channels. So it's not just Channel 13, you've got channels and multiple outlets. What's some of the strategies around, you've got digital broadcast channels, et cetera, about what you're doing on the other, you know, both on the, call it the mothership, as well as the other channels and how you program them?
So we have 3 ships. We have Channel 13, which is our biggest, and then we have Channel 21, which once started in Long Island, but now serves about the same area, and we have NJTV, which serves all of New Jersey. In fact, you can see all of them depending on your cable system all over the tri-state area. But even the days when that would, and that once upon a time would have been enough. Now, because we have digital channels, we have Create, which is sort of a lot of how-to things. We have World, which is a lot of our nonfiction. We have Veme, which is a Spanish-speaking channel. We take a lot of our stuff and translate it. We have our own app, 13 Explorer, so you can see all our stuff online. And then within that, we have YouTube channels where we put a lot of our stuff around. So one thing that we are about is trying to make sure our content is seen everywhere. And we're a little more unconstrained than some of our commercial competitors who had to worry about that. Who, at one time, the world in the commercial view is you need to stay in our ecosphere.
Right.
We don't feel that's the case. And the other thing we have, which nobody else has, and one of my biggest delights in public television, is we have an education department, which I never had before in my years in television. And their job is to take everything we do and integrate it into the classroom. So we are the most respected authority in classrooms. We have a service called PBS Learning Media. It's PBS Learning Media in New York and New Jersey. And we take all our programs and make little bite-sized bits and integrate it into the state regents requirement. So it's available free of charge to teachers and students, and they can use it to teach. And it's a fascinating way and a better way to teach this generation, which is the information age and the video age. So to show them video and make that the center of a learning element is much better than, frankly, some of the ways we used to learn.
And do the schools, I mean, I assume you kind of measure the usage. Are they taking advantage of it? Are they really, you know, leveraging it well?
Yeah. The only thing we can't do, and this is so we know how many teachers download it, but once they download it once, they don't need to download it again, right? So we don't know how many thousands of students they'll reach. Though we hear great stories from teachers who say, I've made history more interesting in a way I couldn't before. You know, in New York State, the biggest, to get a requirement, you have to pass the Regents exams, and the biggest failure is in world history, in part because to a lot of kids it's remote, and it's boring, and it's inaccessible. So what we've done is to try to make video elements out of that. So it's much more interesting to learn about North Korea, to see a documentary we did, just 2 minutes, about a little girl who's in those kind of performance dances, who talks about, for the great leader, how she spent days and days being part of this parade and holding up the placards and how important that was to her. And it's a much better sense of kind of what indoctrination means and living in a totalitarian state than it is a flat piece of literature.
How about with your app and online or digital platforms, what's the demographic mix that you see in terms of, you know, how much are younger people using it? How much are, you know, older people who, again, conventional wisdom would say they're not digital, you know, taking advantage of different platforms?
So the answer is everybody is using it, so that's good. But our online age is about 20 years younger than our broadcast age. So we are unquestionably getting younger people, and we're getting younger people who are finding things in different ways because you can search and find things. So generally, this is to generalize, I think more of our older viewers watch things because they missed it and they want to find out or they want to catch up. I think young people are more likely to come across it in search. So you know, they're doing something on the Middle East and they find a Frontline, right? Whereas opposed to the regular Frontline viewers, I missed last Tuesday's Frontline, I'm going to catch up.
Well, I've got to ask you about what at least I would think would be not maybe the least fun or most challenging part of the job, which you mentioned, which is fundraising, which in some respects everybody has to raise money, but in different ways. You're very public about it in public television. Tell me about what that kind of the challenge of that, and maybe in terms of trying to innovate around that. What can you do in a very crowded marketplace to raise money?
You know, when I first got this job, I had thought I hadn't really raised money before, but as I thought about it, I sort of did, just in a different way. So when I was at NBC and the second Gulf War happened, that was not in the budget. So I had to go to the GE board, explain why we needed $30 million extra that we didn't have in the budget before. And I could have done it two ways. I could have said, you know, we should do this because these are the public airwaves, and brave Americans are going into battle, and it's our public responsibility to do it, which is true. Or I could have said, look, we're the #1 news organization. If we don't cover this the best we can, we'll lose our footing. This could be a transformational point. One of the two networks could pass us, and we will lose the premium we get for being #1, so this is a good investment. Well, both those things were being true. To the GE board, the second thing was a much better appeal. When I talk to people now, it is much more about, let's do good. I say to people, you know what? Video is the most powerful form of communication ever. As we talked about, there's an educational platform to it. So if you want to make good work happen, you want to touch people not just now, but this will live forever on the internet, this is a great way to do it. So I get to speak with my heart as much as my head. So it's actually turned out to be natural to me.
Is that true that the pitch or the discussion with institutions as well as individuals? I can see that people who become a member, right, and have that. But how about the sponsors or the underwriters? What's the pitch and what's the reaction? From those folks, are they saying to you, "That's great, Neal, but I want to see the following, metrics of viewers and time spent, et cetera, that we might get in a in a commercial enterprise?"
There's no doubt underwriters are more commercially driven, and that world has changed a little bit, which is why you see less underwriting now than there used to be. In part because the world has changed. When we were kids, CEOs would feel like it's their responsibility, and so ExxonMobil sponsored Masterpiece Theater for dozens of years, and Texaco sponsored the opera because it was the right thing to do, and they liked the halo effect around it. Now, a lot of those decisions are not made by CEOs. They're made by marketing people, and those marketing people say, look, if you want to sell Mustangs, right, the way people buy Mustangs are white men, 45 to 55, who live in suburbs and make $100,000 a year or more. That's who buys Mustangs. So there's some of those in Downton Abbey, but a lot of people aren't. So I'll put you in the Golf Channel and ESPN and so forth. So there's less of that. On the
but Golf Channel is, not to interrupt, but they're competition for you in a way that maybe years ago it just would have been. It's an entirely different conversation.
So we still have some commercial underwriters, and they still care about the metrics, but also there's still a little bit of, they love having their brand associated with public television. There's more giving on the foundation side and individual side to make up that declination.
Do you, you obviously, there's historically this great relationship between the BBC and PBS and local stations and producers. Are you seething with jealousy when you see the BBC in terms of they're funded by very significant taxpayer funds, and we hardly rate in this country in the same kind of contribution?
I envy their funding model. It's $120 per TV in Britain, where here it's $1.33 per taxpayer per year. So the gap is enormous. On the other hand, it is what it is. So if I could wave a magic wand and I'd wave it, I do bristle a little bit when people say that their funding for public TV is so huge here, when the fact, if it went away, you'd never notice it.
Yeah. Do you see, is there any prospect for that getting any better in terms of public, not necessarily direct grants, but some sort of public-private partnership that involves the government? I know, it's hard to get anything done in Washington on anything now, but is there any ray of light in the midst of maybe that we don't see so obviously?
I think we've both been around long enough to know you can never predict what's going to happen in Washington. I do think what's interesting, and maybe we can tell our story better, public-private partnership is exactly what PBS is. There's a great story when Ken Burns did his first Civil War, the first epic of these long Ken Burns series. He showed it to President Reagan, and Reagan said, "How'd you do this?" And he explained he had a little bit of money from the federal government, and then he multiplied it 6 or 7 times with private donations, which is what we do. So that $1.33 that we get from the federal government gets multiplied 6 or 7 times with other donations.
And amongst all of the various initiatives and focuses you have, news and information, as you mentioned, sort of obviously, historically linked with PBS. And for you personally, obviously, I want to take advantage of the fact I've got, a classic news guy here. Give me your perspective, not just on what's going on at 13, but maybe a bit more broadly about the television news business today. I just saw a criticism from President Obama of not just Fox News, which we might expect, but even MSNBC as well, as kind of creating more divide in the dialogue as opposed to bringing people together or educating. I don't know if that you agree, you think it's unfair, but kind of give me your take on the state of television journalism today.
Well, we live in a capitalist society, and that's good in many ways, but it has affected journalism in 2 fundamental ways. The first way is the notion that news division should make money, which didn't happen in the 60s and even the 70s. There was sort of a lost leader. It was your civic obligation. Then over time, and I benefited from the idea that news should make money because it spawned news magazines, which I did very well and really liked. I liked having a lot of news magazines on TV. So that was good. But it did drive more and more the notion about, it was harder, even when I did it, you'd have to justify why we did an important hour on something when, wouldn't a juicy murder story do just as well? The other big change is there used to be a sense that we're a mass market medium. So there were only 3 networks, there were 3 news divisions. You couldn't take a position or be clear to take a partisan position because you couldn't want to get out of step with the country, right? So the notion that, that's where the broadcast media had to be. Now we've proven because of the multiplicity of channels, you can actually make quite a good living if you carve out a certain genre. So Fox has made a very comfortable living room for conservative viewers, and they spend a lot of time there. And MSNBC, which at one point had wanted to be kind of like CNN, said, you know what, there are not as many of them, but we can do okay with a place for liberals and progressives. And CNN is kind of lost, actually, trying to figure out what to do about that. So I think what you're seeing is the media responding to market forces. It's why, in fact, public media is so important. I think because we are less worried about ratings. We'd like to know who's watching, but we're not going to tailor our broadcasts to try to get a better rating. We're going to do what we think is important.
Does that fractionalization, nichification, if I can make up a word here on the spot, is that creating now more of an opportunity for PBS, for you to do? You've got Frontline. You've obviously got programming in place. Is there more that you think you can do, should do, want to do because of this fractionalized marketplace?
I mean, I hope so. They've made big changes with NewsHour, with Jim Lehrer's retirement. So Judy and Gwen are the anchors, and Sarah Just, who came from ABC's executive producer. And I think that show is doing more tape work and more investigative work, which I think is good. Frontline has always been a great show. So yes, there's more of an opportunity for us, and everybody's sort of gotten out of radio, which is why NPR sort of stands alone. All those big proud radio chains are pretty much gone. What I worry about, and not just as much the journalists, but for democracy, is if you live in a world, which we do increasingly, where you can surround yourself with points of view with which you always agree, you'll never change your mind, right? And the fact is, if you look at the biggest issues of our time, things do change. And even if you had a position at the beginning of something, you at least ought to be open to getting other points of view because, you know, God forbid you change your mind. And now we live in this world where you can just be surrounded by people who tell you you're right, and the guests who tell you you're right. And I worry about that in terms of just where we go for public policy.
Can we make that's a big, big problem, right? Can we make that better, alter the course of that, whether through individual work of broadcasters or publishers, or are we on this inevitable, and there will be not just MSNBC or not just Fox, but Fox Immigration Channel, Fox Economic Policy Channel, and really, is that where it has to go?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think public media is doing a good job, and that's hopefully that we can grow, and maybe that position I articulated can get articulated better as sort of a way to attract viewers. But there's nothing that says we have to be like this. If you look at Britain, they have a proud tradition of there's the Tory paper and the Labour paper, and that's always the way it was, right? And there were a time in the city when we had a lot of papers, and they had not quite articulated views, but so maybe that's where we're heading, and there'll be very few places that will be down the road, middle, broad-based publications.
What do you make of some of the, I'll call them digital-first types of news organizations, and that can include BuzzFeed or Mashable, or Snapchat is now in the news business with Discovery. Are these good for democracy, bad for democracy, neutral? Are they the kinds of platforms, gee, we ought to be doing that, or wow, we never want to be that?
Well, digital in itself is a great idea. Everybody should be playing the digital game. It's how people consume information, so that's great. I think the question is, in terms of content creation, what kind of content are we creating? And how much of it is content based on other people's work? So, I look at some group, people doing investigative reporting on any platform is great. We need more investigative reporting, that's terrific. People who do lists, the 10 biggest scandals in Washington, the 10 ways to lose weight, those are fine. I don't think they add much to a functioning democracy. And people who just leverage other people's work and is fine, but they're not creating anything new either. And what I worry about is if legacy platforms are under fire, and they should go where consolidated, are these new platforms going to take their place? Now, something like Politico is a great example. They actually cover the news. They have reporters out there. That's a great idea. People which are just opining about things, not that opinion is a bad thing, but opinion without facts, opinion without original reporting is useless. And I worry we're heading more towards a land where it's more opinion, more interpretation, less fact-finding.
And what do you make of the print business today? And that's, which has always been such a, not just the New York Times, obviously, but again, especially in an area like investigative journalism where people have had time to do stories and not necessarily with the same, it has to be on at 6:30, et cetera, and you've got to tell it in an X number of minutes. What do you make of the present and future around the print business and maybe your own relationship with it?
I'm actually more optimistic about it. Now that may be caused by the fact that I've been on the Gannett board, so I've had a better seat about smaller papers as opposed to a lot of big city urban papers. Big city urban papers in some markets are clearly under fire, and those may be challenged. But in smaller markets, in neighborhoods, I think there's a huge upside because there aren't other people doing that. There aren't people covering the sewer commission except reporters going out and doing it. And what's exciting about a lot of those smaller papers is they are integrating with the apps and finding ways to distribute information digitally. Printing presses may go away one day. So what? Yeah. Right? The important thing is that we still deliver news and there's still journalists out there covering it. And some of those chains of small papers are actually still hiring reporters. So I'm optimistic about that. I worry, look at in the city of New York, we have 3 papers all driven by powerful people who have their own personal fortune to help keep those papers alive. I don't know what would happen without that.
And we didn't talk about local news, local television news, which is, again, one of those areas where I think you've still got a number of people that view local news, and that's how they get their news, and yet it feels like so much frustration about what local news is or isn't or should be and doesn't measure up. What's your kind of, again, sort of where we are and where maybe we ought to go with local, particularly local broadcast news?
I still think there's huge possibilities for local news, and in some markets they do outstanding work. I was just at Columbia a couple weeks ago for the DuPont Awards, and there were some astounding great local projects being done. I mean, there's, Tip O'Neill's right, all politics is local, there's great things there. I think there's huge possibilities there.
Well, with that, Neal, I think I think we've come to the end of our evening, but I will say thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff. Good night.